I moved to Bosque dos Ciprestes residential in a perfect fall morning. Reddish bricks, pristine lawns, and a golden gate that swung open to reveal my new home. After years of saving, I finally managed to buy a house in this high-end community that promised peace and quiet. Ironically, the very things I never found here. Barely had I unloaded the first boxes when I noticed a guy in sunglasses and a burly man with a clipboard marching toward my entrance. Both were wearing polo shirts embroidered with Homeowners Association security. "ID, please," the guy in sunglasses demanded, not even bothering with a greeting. "I'm moving in. I'm the new owner," I replied, extending my hand for a handshake that was never returned. "Standard protocol. We need to check who's coming into the community," insisted the burly guy, tapping his pen on the clipboard as if I were testing his patience. "Michael Anderson. I bought house 237, I explained as I pulled out my wallet. The guy in sunglasses, who I later found out is named Travis Reynolds, snatched my wallet from my hand and scrutinized my ID with disdain. "You didn't let us know about your move today. We need a 72-hour notice for any entry of large vehicles." I took a deep breath. "The real estate agency should have informed you. I have all the documentation approved." "Infraction number 1, muttered the burly man, Derek, furiously jotting down on his clipboard. "Fine of $250 for lack of notification. My first day in paradise cost me $250. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this." 3 days later, I found a red envelope stuck to my door. Violation notice. It said my lawn was 5 mm above the allowed height. A $100 fine. That was absurd. I'd just mowed the grass yesterday. The following week, another notice. My trash was visible from the street for 17 minutes longer than allowed. $150. 1 week, the paint on my door was in Desert Sunset when it was supposed to be Canyon Blush. $150. Another week, my door's paint was in Desert Sunset when it should be Canyon Blush. $200. From my window, I started watching Travis and Derek roaming the neighborhood, snapping photos, making notes. They seemed especially focused on my house. Walking around the block, I noticed other residents averting their eyes when the HOA guys passed by. Some even hurried back inside. At a mandatory community barbecue, an elderly lady named Eleanor whispered to me, "Watch out for them. They fined my husband while he was in the hospital just because there were leaves in his yard. And when we complained, the fine doubled." That's when I realized it wasn't just harassment towards a newcomer. It was an established intimidation system keeping the entire community in a state of constant fear. The sound of footsteps in my yard at 11 p.m. woke me up. From my bedroom window, I saw Travis and Derek using flashlights to inspect my house. Travis was snapping pics of the bushes, while Derek was measuring something with a tape measure. I quietly got downstairs and left out the back door. I circled the house and positioned myself behind them. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Both jumped like startled cats. Travis regained his composure first. "Night inspection, authorized by Clause 47B of the rules. At 11 at night, on private property without prior consent?" I asked calmly. "That sounds more like trespassing." Derek stepped forward. "Listen here, newbie. The HOA has the authority to—" I opened my coat, revealing my police badge. "Chief Michael Anderson, Lakeview Police Department. I'm pretty familiar with the law, including what deals with trespassing." Even in the dim light, Travis's face visibly paled. "We didn't know that. Get off my property, now. Any future inspections need to be scheduled during business hours with my prior consent. And you're gonna need more than a little clause to justify what you just did." I watched as they hurried out through the side gate. For a brief moment, I felt I'd set some boundaries. An illusion that lasted less than 24 hours. The reprisals started the very next morning. An emergency summons for hostile behavior toward HOA officers required my presence at a disciplinary hearing. The fines kept piling up, 3 in one day, all for infractions that were impossible to verify. Excessive noise at 3 a.m. I was on duty that night. Unauthorized vehicle. That was my official cruiser. I discreetly installed security cameras around the property. I meticulously documented every notice, every interaction. At night, I'd research state and local laws governing homeowners associations. I discovered loopholes, limitations, and clear overreaches in the Bosque dos Ciprestes HOA practices. A neighbor, Sarah, knocked on my door with tears in her eyes. They hiked my condo fee by 70% when I contested a fine for having a flower pot the wrong color. My husband's out of work. I don't know how we're gonna pay. Other residents began coming to me quietly. An elderly man showed me fines totaling $5,000 for excess water consumption. He needed continuous irrigation on medical advice because of respiratory issues. A family got an eviction notice for missing a payment during a medical emergency. Why doesn't anyone legally challenge this? I asked Eleanor during a walk. William Simmons, the HOA president, is a partner at the biggest law firm in the area. Few local lawyers will take a case against them. And if you complain, well, things just get worse. It became clear. The harassment wasn't random. It was systematically aimed at the most vulnerable. It was time to act. My summons for the disciplinary hearing arrived on official letterhead. 6 p.m., Community Center. Mandatory attendance, absence, will result in a $500 fine. I decided to show up, but on my own terms. I got to the community center at exactly 6 p.m., wearing my full official chief of police uniform. A murmur went through the room as I entered. At the front, sitting at an elevated table like judges, were the 7 HOA board members, led by William Simmons, a silver-haired man in a sharp suit. Mr. Anderson, you've been summoned to answer for multiple violations of the Code of Conduct, Simmons announced in a monotonous tone of authority. Chief Anderson, I corrected calmly. And before we begin, I'd like to state that I'm officially recording this proceeding. I placed a recorder on the table in front of me. Travis, sitting to Simmons's right, leaned over to whisper something but was cut off. First, Simmons continued as if I hadn't spoken, you exhibited aggressive behavior toward our security officers during a routine inspection. Security officers? Interesting. According to state records, none of the HOA staff are certified security personnel. And as for that routine 11 p.m. inspection, I have recordings that show illegal trespassing. I opened my folder and began handing out documents. Here are copies of the 43 notices I received in just 30 days, along with evidence refuting each one. I've also included official notifications to the State Housing Department detailing predatory practices, systematic intimidation, and possible extortion. William Simmons's face grew redder and redder as I maintained a professional tone. The room, initially filled with just board members and a few selected witnesses, started drawing in other residents who had heard the commotion. This hearing is adjourned, declared Simmons, banging his gavel. Actually, it isn't, I replied, presenting another document. This is an official subpoena for an investigation into possible financial crimes involving the association's funds. From now on, all the HOA financial records are under legal custody. That's when I realized the real battle was just beginning. The morning after the hearing brought an eerie silence. No notices, no surprise visits. The community felt like it had entered a state of suspension. Residents watched me from afar, with expressions mixing hope and apprehension. To many, I had become the HOA's thorn in their side. To others, maybe just a fool who didn't understand the consequences of challenging the system. The real blow came 3 days later. I was coming home from work when I found my driveway blocked by a tow truck. The driver, looking visibly embarrassed, handed me an official HOA document. Removal of an unauthorized vehicle from private property, he explained without meeting my eyes. Orders from the board. The document in my hand revealed something even more alarming. A notice demanding payment of accumulated fines totaling $112,000, with a 72-hour deadline to pay, or they'd start foreclosure proceedings. The list included absurd infractions like unauthorized modification of the house structure, I had just replaced a burnt-out light bulb, and misuse of an official uniform on private property. Apparently, wearing my police uniform inside my own house violated some obscure rule. I'm not gonna move my car, I told the driver. And I suggest you don't either, unless you've got a valid court order, which you clearly don't. He seemed relieved by my response and left quickly. I got inside only to discover that my water supply had been shut off. A notice on the door said emergency maintenance that could last an indefinite amount of time. That night, sitting in my office by flashlight, the power had also been temporarily interrupted for maintenance. I organized every document, every recording, every piece of evidence I had painstakingly collected over the past weeks. I started receiving messages from other residents. People are spreading rumors that you have a criminal record. Travis is snapping pictures of anyone who talks to you. Simmons called an emergency meeting only for approved members. Around 2 a.m., the security system I'd installed, thankfully with a backup battery, alerted me to movement in the backyard. The cameras showed 3 hooded figures crossing my yard. I immediately recognized Derek's distinctive gait, even under a disguise. I didn't move. I just watched as they tried to force the back door with a tool that looked like a crowbar. Then they tried a side window. Finally, one of them, Judging by the silhouette, probably Travis, poured something along the exterior wall. I caught the smell of gasoline before they even lit the first match. I activated the external sprinkler system I'd strategically set up days before. At the same time, the exterior lights, hooked up to a separate generator, lit up the entire yard like a football field. The alarm blared at ear-shattering volume, and my phone automatically sent the live images to the police department. The three men fled in a panic, slipping on the wet grass. One of them, Derek, fell hard against the side fence, losing his hood. His face was clearly captured by the high-definition camera. 15 minutes later, 3 police cruisers arrived at the community. The officers, many of whom were my direct subordinates, looked a mix of shocked and furious as they saw the recordings. The criminal attempt to set fire to the police chief's own home wasn't just a serious crime. It was a declaration of war. I want search and seizure warrants for the HOA offices and homes of every board member by dawn, I instructed my team. And I want protection for all the residents who have provided information. Tonight has crossed every line. While the officers collected evidence in my yard, I noticed lights flicking on in several neighboring houses. Soon, residents began coming out, some still in pajamas, watching the police activity. I saw fear in their eyes, but also something I hadn't noticed before: determination. An elderly lady timidly approached. "They did that to me too," she said, her voice trembling. After I challenged the fines, "They didn't try to burn my house, but they cut down my century-old tree in the middle of the night. They said it was a landscape violation." Others began coming forward with their own stories. A young couple had their son barred from using the community pool because kids disturbed the tranquility. A retired teacher was fined for giving private lessons at home, commercial use of residential property. An immigrant family saw their fees double without explanation when they hung their national flag on the porch. Under the night sky, lit by the pulsating lights of police cars, a silenced community was finally starting to find its voice. The operation started at 6 a.m. 18 officers, divided into coordinated teams, executed search and seizure warrants simultaneously at 9 different locations: the HOA's administrative office, William Simmons' residence, and the houses of the other 7 board members. I deliberately kept my distance from the operation to avoid any claim of a conflict of interest. Instead, I worked with the district attorney to organize the case. The recordings of the attempted arson had already been classified as Class A evidence, but we suspected this was just the beginning of a much larger web of irregularities. At 10:43, I got a call from Lieutenant Rodriguez, in charge of the search at Simmons's house. "Chief, you need to see this. We found a safe in his office with 2 sets of ledgers. One set for show, and the other, well, showing the real numbers." 2 hours later, in a secure room at the police department, I examined the seized documents. What emerged was a financial scheme that went far beyond abusive fines. For over 8 years, the HOA board had diverted about 70% of the maintenance fees to personal offshore accounts. The fines, some running into hundreds of thousands of dollars, were just the tip of the iceberg. We found evidence that the HOA had forced homeowners to sell their properties for far below market value after systematic harassment campaigns. These houses were then bought by shell companies belonging to board members and resold for enormous profits. Even more disturbing was the discovery of detailed dossiers on each resident: financial history, medical records, family issues, specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited for intimidation. The level of surveillance and invasion of privacy was almost unbelievable. "This is too organized to be just a corrupt HOA," commented District Attorney Jenkins while reviewing the documents. "We're looking at an operation of extortion and money laundering under the guise of a homeowners association." I issued subpoenas for the last 10 years of bank records for every board member. The results confirmed our suspicions: regular deposits matching exactly the administrative fee hikes. On the 3rd day after the searches, I received an unexpected visit at my office. Eleanor, the elderly lady who had first warned me about the HOA, came in with a man in his 60s who introduced himself as Thomas Weber, the ex-accountant for the association. "I was forced out 3 years ago," explained Weber, placing a folder on my desk. "When I questioned some discrepancies in the accounts, Simmons threatened me. Not just me, but my family. My granddaughter's scholarship was, coincidentally, denied the following week." The folder contained copies of suspicious transactions that Weber had secretly documented over the years. More importantly, it included the names of municipal officials who had received contributions to ignore complaints against the HOA. "Why come now?" I asked. Eleanor gripped the accountant's hand firmly. "Because someone is finally doing something. Because we're not alone anymore." That afternoon, I got a court order to access the servers of the management company overseeing the community. Our digital analysis team worked non-stop for 36 hours processing the data. What we discovered was a sophisticated operation stretching across several communities in the region, all managed by the same group. A week after the attempted arson at my home, I held a joint press conference with the Federal Public Prosecutor's Office. We announced the arrest of William Simmons, Travis Reynolds, Derek Thompson, and 4 other HOA board members on charges including extortion, conspiracy to form a criminal organization, tax fraud, money laundering, attempted arson, and conspiracy. This investigation has uncovered one of the largest real estate extortion schemes in the state's history, District Attorney Jenkins declared to the cameras. Under the disguise of a simple homeowners association, this group operated a criminal organization that victimized hundreds of families over a decade. As the operation made national headlines, something extraordinary began happening at Bosque dos Ciprestes. Residents who barely exchanged greetings before started coming together in groups, sharing stories, and offering each other support. The fear that had kept the community fragmented was gradually being replaced by solidarity. "It's like we're coming out of a dictatorship," commented Sarah, the neighbor who had cried at my door weeks earlier. "People are finally talking to each other without fear of being reported for unauthorized socializing." The most moving evidence came when the forensic team discovered, buried in the garden of the HOA headquarters, the old community bell that had been removed years ago for causing excessive noise. In fact, we later learned from seized documents that the bell had been taken down because it symbolized community unity, exactly what the corrupt administration feared most. The regional court had never seen such a crowd. Residents from Bosque dos Ciprestes and 5 other communities managed by the same group packed the corridors for the preliminary hearing of the accused. Many held up signs with photos of lost properties, shattered dreams, and the simple slogan, "Our homes, our rules." William Simmons, once imposing in his expensive suits, looked significantly smaller in the orange prison uniform. Travis and Derek sat dejectedly next to their lawyers, avoiding eye contact with the audience, many of whom were their victims watching the proceedings. "Your Honor," argued the defense attorney, "my clients were merely enforcing rules that every homeowner agreed to when signing the purchase contracts." Judge Crawford, known for her strict impartiality, adjusted her glasses. "Curious. I went through these contracts. I don't recall any clause that allowed extortion, trespassing, and attempted manslaughter." A murmur of approval swept through the room. As the case progressed, more shocking evidence emerged. We discovered that the HOA had installed listening devices in common areas. There were records of hidden cameras monitoring specific residences, especially those belonging to people who had questioned the board's authority. The most impactful testimony came from Marta Hernandez, a 72-year-old widow who had lost her home 2 years earlier. "My husband had just passed away. I found a notice saying I needed to repaint the entire house within 48 hours. It was impossible. The next day, the fine doubled. Then, it tripled. In 1 week, I owed more than my annual pension. When I contested, Mr. Simmons personally offered me help, that I could sell my house to one of their partner companies for 40% of its market value to clear the debt." The investigation revealed that the partner company was registered in Simmons's wife's name. The defense's case quickly fell apart when ex-HOA employees began testifying in exchange for immunity. A former secretary revealed that there were lists of priority targets, residents considered the most vulnerable or likely to cave under pressure. They called it the quarterly harvest, she testified, visibly shaken. They needed to force at least 3 homeowners to sell every quarter to keep the cash flow going. On the 10th day of trial, Travis Reynolds took a plea deal with the prosecution. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he provided full details of the operation, including the names of corrupt public officials who had allowed the scheme to prosper for so long. The turning point came when the forensics team finalized their analysis of the HOA's finances. Of the $12.7 million collected in maintenance fees and fines over 8 years, only $1.9 million had actually been spent on community services. The rest had disappeared into a complex network of shell companies. "This case isn't about minor HOA rule violations," District Attorney Jenkins declared in her closing argument. "It's about a group of predators who found a legal way to terrorize an entire community. They used arbitrary rules as weapons to get rich at the expense of people's suffering." The verdict came after just 2 days of jury deliberation. Guilty on all charges. William Simmons received 22 years in federal prison. Travis and Derek got 15 years each. The other board members received sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years, depending on their involvement. As law enforcement led the convicted out, I noticed Eleanor quietly crying at the back of the room. I approached her after the session. "Are those tears of joy?" I asked. "Relief," she replied, gripping my hand with surprising strength for someone her age. "My husband didn't live to see this day. Their pressure worsened his heart condition. But today he'd be proud of all of us." In the following days, as the dust settled, one more discovery brought shock and vindication. In a secret safe in Simmons's vacation home, investigators found a document titled Community Control Manual, a methodological guide detailing how to establish psychological dominance over residential communities through tactics of intimidation, social isolation, and financial exploitation. On the last page, a handwritten note from Simmons summed up his philosophy. People who are afraid of losing their homes will do anything to keep them. Real power isn't about owning property, but owning people's fear. The court ordered that the assets confiscated from the convicted be used to create a compensation fund for the victims. Families who had lost their homes due to the scheme could apply for restitution. The HOA itself was legally dissolved, paving the way for the residents to decide their own future. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this. 3 months after the trial, we held the first truly democratic neighborhood meeting at Bosque dos Ciprestes. The community center, once the stage for manipulated disciplinary hearings, was completely transformed. The trial-style tables had been replaced by a circular seating arrangement that allowed everyone to see each other as equals. "Welcome to our very first community gathering," I started, looking around at the faces that had become familiar. "We have no strict rules today, just one simple question. What kind of community do we want to build?" The initial silence quickly gave way to a wave of participation. People who had lived side by side for years without really knowing each other began sharing visions and ideas. Some were timid at first, others more outspoken, but all with a new confidence in their voices. "We need some basic rules," argued a retired engineer. "But rules that bring us together, not control us. I want to be able to plant a garden without asking for permission for every single seed," said a young mother, rocking her baby in her arms. "And what if, instead of fines, we had a community contribution system?" suggested a university professor. "Anyone who can't maintain their garden gets help from the neighbors, not punishment." Thomas Weber, the ex-accountant who exposed the scheme, was now leading the interim finance committee. He presented a transparent report on the current situation. "With the old management gone, we discovered that we can run all essential services for less than a third of the fees we used to pay." The revelation brought spontaneous applause. Eleanor stood up, leaning on her cane. "I propose that part of the savings be directed to a fund to help residents in temporary difficulty, so we never see families lose their homes again because they can't pay an abusive fee or fine." The proposal was unanimously approved. In the following weeks, the community went through a visible transformation. The identical white fences that were once mandatory began to give way to individuality. Some chose to keep them, others replaced them with blooming shrubs or small gardens. The doors, once restricted to an approved color palette, now showcased hues that reflected the personality of their owners. More significant was the change in the pace of community life. Kids played freely in the yards without the constant fear of noise violations. Impromptu barbecues brought together neighbors who barely said hello before. The old community bell was reinstalled in the central plaza, its sound now symbolizing not authority, but celebration. The event that truly marked our transformation happened 6 months after the trial. A severe storm hit the region, causing significant damage to several properties. Even before we could organize an official response, I witnessed something extraordinary. Residents coming out of their homes to help each other. Mr. Chen, whose roof had been partly destroyed, found 10 neighbors working together to cover it with tarps even before he could assess the damage. The Rodriguez family, whose fence had been knocked down, came home to find it already rebuilt by a group of volunteers. That night, we set up an impromptu community shelter in the community center for families whose homes were temporarily uninhabitable. We shared food, blankets, and stories. Eleanor, now the honorary president of the new community board, moved among the groups with an energy that defied her age, making sure everyone was comfortable. "You know what's even more amazing?" she told me as we watched the scene. Under the old regime, a storm would be an excuse to dole out fines for not repairing damages quickly enough. Now, it's a chance to show who we really are. The following spring, we officially inaugurated the Renewal Garden, a community space created on the land where the old HOA office once stood. Every family planted something: fruit trees, flowers, medicinal herbs. A central mosaic, crafted from pieces donated by each household, told our story in images, from identical fences to colorful diversity, from oppression to freedom. During the inauguration ceremony, I was invited to say a few words. I looked around at the faces surrounding me. Some I'd gotten to know during their most vulnerable moments. Others I'd only observed from afar as they transformed. When I moved here, I began. I was just looking for a house, a place to store my stuff and rest after work. What I found was a lesson on power and control, but what we built together later turned out to be something far more valuable, a real community. As the bell rang to celebrate the new beginning, I realized that our story had become more than just a victory against corruption. It was a reminder that even in the most oppressive systems, resistance begins when one person refuses to accept injustice as normal. And that true strength isn't in arbitrary rules or the fear they inspire, but in the bonds we create when we decide, together, that our homes and our lives belong to us. Bosque dos Ciprestes, once known for its pristine fences and identical lawns, was now celebrated for something far more valuable. A community where people not only lived side by side, but truly lived together. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this.